Okay, so we're going to talk in this video about lexical and grammatical classes of words. And to do that, we're going to start briefly by talking about parts of speech. So I'm guessing that probably everybody has heard the phrase parts of speech before. Okay. What parts of speech refers to in terms of grammar are word classes. Okay. And for our purposes, we're talking about word classes because they allow us to be much more specific. There are two main types of word classes that we should be aware of. One is the lexical word class, and two is the grammatical word class. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what some of the differences between these two classes are. So when we're talking about lexical word classes, we are referring to the classes of words that form the content of the sentence. These are often open classes. And what open classes mean is that you can add new words. Okay. Grammatical classes are a little bit different. Grammatical classes are the words that tend to provide linkages in a sentence. They are also usually closed classes of words, and that just means the opposite, which is that usually they don't admit new words. Okay. So think about it this way, and I'm going to talk specifically about kind of what some of those classes are. So an example of a lexical class would be nouns. Oop, if I can spell noun. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples, right? These are classes that admit new words. Tweeting, texting, right? New verbs. Bootylicious, new adjective, very popular in like the 90s or 2000s. That's going to be a little bit different from grammatical classes of words, which are things like auxiliary verbs. So auxiliary verbs are going to be verbs like will, should, can, do, those sorts of things. It also includes conjunctions, right? And, but, so we can have the acronym fanboys because there are only 7 coordinating conjunctions in English. Pronouns and prepositions. And I would like you to kind of think about the difference. How hard is it to introduce new pronouns into English, right? Like, how resistant are people? Far less resistant to introduce words like texting or tweeting or emojis or bootylicious than to introduce new pronouns. So that difference or distinction between closed and open classes is really important, as is that difference between content and linkage. So talking about word classes allows us to get a little bit more specific in terms of how we're identifying and thinking about those forms that we attach to parts of speech. All right, so continuing on, this distinction between lexical and grammatical classes also matters as far as helping us think about definitions. So there are several different types of definitions. Semantic definitions are definitions that identify meaning, whereas structural definitions are definitions that identify function. And another way of thinking about this is like you can test the definition. So instead of just like describing the type of word, it like gives you a clear way to test and see whether or not the word functions as it should in order to like belong to that word class. So let's talk a little bit about nouns. I'm assuming that with nouns, you guys grew up with what I did, which is nouns are a person, place, thing, or idea. Okay. Um, so this is a semantic definition, really hard to test. It just tells me like what the words are supposed to mean. It doesn't really give me anything to do with them. So especially like if you're working with younger people, so I was an SAT tutor for a while, so this sort of thing helped me. Giving clear guidelines and tests can be really helpful for ensuring that students can actually like identify types of words. So the two kind of keys to identifying a noun in terms of the structural definition is that a noun can be preceded by the, and it can be made plural. Okay. So both of these criteria have to be met in order for something to be a noun, right? So for instance, I could say the oxen, right? So I've taken ox, made it plural, and I can put the in front of it. I could say the boxes. I could also say the readings. So this is an example of a gerund, in that it's a verb that has come to function like a noun. So I can actually test, right? If I tried to say, the things, right? Not a noun, right? That does not work. And that's because sings is a verb. Okay. So the semantic definitions are going to, for the most part, allow us to test things pretty concretely. So let's take a look at verbs then. I don't know about you guys, but I was told action or state of being words, right? Again, not a lot to be able to test there. The structural definition is that they can be made um, present or past tense, right? Or I should say present and past tense because they have to be able to do both. So I could say I read or I read, right? I could say I swim or I swam. I can say I am or I was, and thus all of those words are verbs, right? Because they can be made present and past tense. So as far as adjectives go, these get a little bit more interesting, or I should say a little bit more detailed. So what I learned about adjectives was that they describe nouns, right? Words that describe nouns. Not terrible, but again, not as specific as it could be. So let's talk about the structural definition. Adjectives can come after determiners and before nouns, right? So now we're getting concrete. We're talking much more specifically about them. So if I said the yellow chick, right? Yellow would be my adjective, because the is a determiner and chick is a noun. So yellow comes after the, but before chick, right? So we are looking at placement. Here it is considered to be an attributive adjective, which means it gives an attribute to a noun. Okay. Another way that adjectives can be checked is that they can appear after to be verbs. Okay. So here's an example. I was warm. Warm is an adjective. Was is a to be verb. Okay. This is an example of a predicative adjective, which means that it follows a predicate. Okay. The last way that you can test adjectives is that they can also usually end in ER or EST or be preceded by more or most. And let me once again give you a couple of examples. They were the luckiest kids ever, right? Um, luckiest here functions as an adjective. I can also say luckier, right? I could also say they were more lucky than they'd ever been, right? So more lucky, lucky here would be an adjective, right? It is also entirely possible to say most lucky, right? Like they were the most lucky kids I ever knew. So when you're talking about testing, I can do luckier, luckiest, more lucky, most lucky, right? So that tells me that it is in fact an adjective. And this type of adjective is called a superlative. And what that means is that it allows for comparison to be made or established. Now, adverbs are a little bit trickier because with them, there is actually no simple test. Okay. So the semantic definition I grew up with is that they end in ly. There are plenty of adverbs that do not end in ly. So unfortunately with adverbs, as far as the structural definition goes, there's no simple test. One of the key things is that they usually don't modify nouns, but they do modify adjectives, adverbs, phrases, and clauses. As well, I probably shouldn't have put an and there. Let me remove it because they also modify verbs. So one of the ways that you can kind of test as far as adverbs go would be to look for the word it modifies. And if the word it's modifying is not a noun, then that can be a helpful way to test. Something else to be aware of is that there are 7 common types of adverbs. I am not going to talk about each one here, but the book, and specifically the chapter you'll look at on adverbs, does address all of them. So adverbs in some ways are kind of like subordinating conjunctions. Once you get used to seeing them, you can usually find them, but sometimes it takes a little bit more time to become familiar. So the best structural test I can give you is to try to identify the word that it modifies, and if that word is not a noun, then you're probably dealing with an adverb.